Hi everyone, and sorry once more for the prolonged gap between videos. I've been very busy at work recently, but I'm hoping to make more videos in the upcoming future, especially with the World Chess Championships coming up next month. I'd like to start a new feature on the chess channel called Magnuswatch, as Magnus Carlsen is probably the most popular player in the world at the moment, and so I think it's important to keep an eye both on him and his games. He came second at Tata Steel this year after a very impressive performance from Levon Aronian, who is hot on his heels on the rating list at the moment. Today I thought we would have a look at their encounter in that tournament, as they're the two highest rated players in the world, and make it the first video in the Magnuswatch vein. So to get underway, Carlsen had white and opened with c4, which he plays approximately 10%, sorry about that, of the time, and his opening versatility, as I've said before, is one of his many strengths. c4 is the English opening, and it's a flexible choice. It's classified as a flank opening because it's not going for the center straight away with e4 or d4, and it stakes a claim immediately to the important central square d5, and knight c3 can be played later after this move, first c4, and there's no problems regarding the mobility of the c-pawn, which is obviously desirable. And it's an opening that has a lot of transpositional potential, with the added benefit that it can avoid the main lines of tricky openings like the Nimzo Indian if white so desires. The sharpest response, probably best, is an immediate e5 from black, where we have a reversed Sicilian. Aronian, however, answered with e6, which is equally flexible, and as with Carlsen's opening move, has a lot of transpositional potential. Indeed, after the next series of moves, knight c3, d5 and d4, we reached a standard Queen's Gambit declined position, which is timelessly popular at the top level of chess. Aronian continued with bishop e7, which is an unusual and fairly uncommon choice, but has the advantage from black's standpoint of dealing with the pin that white can create with bishop g5 if black plays knight f6 instead, and denies white the opportunity of putting pressure on the black position in conjunction with this pressure here on d5. However, white is now able to play c takes d5, which Carlsen did, and after e takes d5, white has two central pawns against one, which is a claim to an advantage if utilized correctly. And ultimately Carlsen is a positional player, so this approach suits his style, and we're still well within main lines of opening theory here. And he continued with bishop f4, which gets the bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e3, and applies a bit of pressure to c7. Aronian bolstered his center and kept things solid with c6, also preventing knight b5, and white scores well from here with very small winning percentage for black and a reasonably high amount of draws as well. And as we've seen, Carlsen is more than willing to enter these lines where white can build up slowly and gradually crush his opponent. That's what he does best, amongst other things. And here he played queen c2, which has a few ideas in mind, one of them being to prevent bishop f5, but also to support the central e4 push, which white will want to play later, and it's also a little prophylaxis against the later c5 push from black, just the queen eyeing the c file there, and c5 is always going to leave black with this weak d pawn, so he has to be careful about playing it. And combined with bishop f4 controlling e5 in conjunction with the d4 pawn, this gives white a decent enough grip on the position already, and makes it difficult for black to equalize anytime soon. So knight f6, and now a calm and again slow move from Carlsen with h3, who presumably was in some kind of preparation. And he's played these kinds of moves before in the opening phases of the game, and whilst generally they're not a good idea on standard principles, Carlsen is clearly the kind of player who knows when it is safe to include such a move in the opening phase of the game. Again, it's a positional and prophylactic move that prevents black from using the g4 square for his pieces, most notably his bishop, and after a later knight f3. And it also says to black that a pawn storm could be coming his way if he castles too quickly. So g6 is how Aronian continued, presumably to enable bishop f5, which is developing with tempo, due to the attack on the queen. So e3 and now bishop f5, which also takes firm control of the e4 square, the knight, the pawn and the bishop, definitely making sure that no e4 push can be played without due preparation. So queen d2 from Carlsen, keeping everything fluid with the white pieces. Also possible was queen b3, which can sometimes be an automatic move once the queenside bishop is developed, but black can answer with the dynamic queen b6, allowing queen takes b6, a takes b6, and easy equalization despite these double pawns. It's no big deal, and the a file can be good. So queen d2 anyway is what Carlsen played, and now came h5, and clearly Aronian was after a sharp battle and the kind of tactical complications in which he excels with this move. And bishop d3 from Carlsen, which is a surprising move because he could have played this instead of queen d2, and after bishop f5 was played, and he's lost the tempo in the sequence as it occurred in the game. And the only difference is that black has played h5 now, and I don't really think that has much bearing on this choice of move. White has to contest this bishop on the diagonal anyway, if only because it plays a strong role in controlling the e4 square, as well as being just nicely posted on this diagonal. And after bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, black is left with the better bishop, given the pawn structure in the center, but white has better central control overall, having regained control of the e4 square. And the pawn structure isn't fixed, so white almost has a ready-made plan here of finishing development and playing for f3 and e4, which will improve both his bishop and his pawn center. Aronian continued with knight b d7, which is just standard development and preparation for the c5 pawn break, which is one of black's ideas in this opening and similar structures. He has to be careful not to play this too soon though, because as I said, it will leave him with an isolated queen's pawn. So Aronian correctly continues his piece development, but it's fair to say that white has a good overall control of the position already, and gained an edge, albeit slight, out of the opening. Carlsen continued with knight g e2, which is retaining flexibility with his f pawn, so he can play f3 and e4. And Aronian struck out with a5, with the idea of creating some queenside initiative later. And it's an interesting position already, with white having firm central control and black pushing both of his rook's pawns, for pressure down the flanks. And this move too is something of a waiting move to see how white wants to proceed. There's little worse in the opening stage than castling into an attack, and this may be threatened if Aronian castles immediately here. But Carlsen castled now, and after that Aronian saw no problem in doing the same, so he castled, and now the middle game can begin. And there's no need to delay, and Carlsen started immediately with the plan I mentioned already. It's f3, and this is somewhat weakening on the dark squares around the king, but black is not well placed to exploit this anytime soon, and positionally it's the correct move. Aronian continued on the queen side with b5, which is a double-edged move, as it gains space, but it comes at the cost of creating this weak pawn on c6, which is on an open file. But Aronian has some ideas in mind, as we'll see. So Carlsen can now push with e4, which creates a very nice pawn center and improves the flexibility and mobility of his bishop in one go, which is all very nice play. So d takes e4 is how Aronian continued, breaking the central tension immediately. And Fritz now gives white a good edge at over half a pawn with f takes e4. And you know, white has achieved the ideal pawn center whilst black has no central pawns himself. And instead of d takes e4, after e4 had been played, you know, Aronian can play instead b4. But white still has a good edge after knight a4, and for example, c5, e5, c4, queen c2, knight h7, and either e6, undermining g6, which the queen is attacking, or bishop h6, you know, which is also good, getting a tempo on the rook and moving it away from the f-file where whites could potentially have pressure later after this pawn advances. But the main idea is e6, I think, is almost definitely best here. Okay, so we'll go back to where we were. So d takes e4, f takes e4, and knight c5 is how Aronian continued, exploiting the pin down the d file. So obviously there's no d takes c5 or the queen is dropping. And this move also attacks the e4 pawn, which knight on f6 is also attacking. So the queen is now forced to defend it, but this isn't a problem for white. And after queen f3, solving the tactical problems, white retains a good edge, and Aronian must move his knight now on c5. He could play b4 instead, but this is inferior after an immediate e5, and Aronian clearly has a setup in mind for his pieces, as he played a knight e6 now, threatening to take this bishop and also applying pressure to the d4 pawn, which is backward on an open file, so theoretically weak. In actual fact, white's central pawns are in a position that's known as hanging pawns, which I did a short series about a couple of years ago. Usually they are on the C and D files and represent a dynamic imbalance, as black can aim to attack them now, as Aronian is pursuing here, whilst white can push them at the correct moment. And you know, the constant threat of either push makes move selection a lot more complicated for the player playing against them. Here they are strong for white. If black ever plays c5, for example, it can be met with e5, and later and after the knight moves d5, and you know, it's going to knock back the black knights and gives black a lot of difficulty. For now, Carlsen is content to preserve his bishop and defend the d4 pawn in one move with bishop e3, and Aronian continued with b4, gaining space with tempo, and Carlsen undeveloped with knight b1. It's the correct move, because knight a4 strands the knight out of the game, and it could become a tactical liability on a4, and from here it can reroute to d2 and c4, which is a perfect outpost square now, because it can never be attacked by pawns. There's no d or b pawns on the black side anymore, so you know, it's definitely the correct move. So Aronian now played knight h7, threatening both knight g5 and also f5 at the right moment for counterplay, and Aronian was certainly giving Carlsen a tough time and a good run for his money. So immediately Carlsen brings his knight back into the game, you know, a wise decision of course, and white is now able to play knight c4 at the right moment, as I said, and you know, increase slowly his positional advantages. Aronian continued with the rook c8, and the idea here is just to defend the c pawn so that he can play f5. If he plays that with this rook on a8, after f takes e5, rook takes, sorry, f5, there'll be queen takes c6, so that's no good. Okay, that's the end of part 1.